I'm going to start off, as all good engineers should, every time they give a presentation, with a formula, but we'll come back to that later. So let's look at what this presentation is going to comprise. So first of all, I'm going to look at improving our culture, but from the bottom up, which is a slightly different position. Then we're going to look at a big hurdle that's in the way that could prevent this improvement to our culture. The next thing is I'm going to tell you something about something you probably don't know about, which is this new guide. And have your phone camera ready, because I'm going to tell you how you'll be able to get a free copy of it. There'll be some instructions on the screen. Next thing I'm going to talk about is key principles for designers and who can apply them. And then costs, inevitably. And then finally, how we can get traction for this initiative. Now, the thing is, many hardened practitioners will think these ideas just won't happen, but please stay with me throughout this presentation, and I'm hoping I'll be able to convince you otherwise. Now, the Building Safety Act is vital. It initiates many good things, but it will take years for this culture change to really permeate throughout the industry from the top down. Dame Judith talked about industry taking the initiative and creating initiatives that act now. And I'm going to outline a complementary initiative, very relevant to designers, that tackles an important part of the culture change needed, and that can gain traction faster, but from the bottom up. So I mean, from the bottom of the industry, the people who are on the coalface actually doing the work. Now, first of all, let's look at each member of a project team and see how their culture needs to change. And I apologize, some forward-thinking organizations have already changed their culture, and I hope they will forgive me for generalizing. But anyway, let's start with the client. So clients need to stay more closely involved with their projects. In the employer's requirements, they need to set out not only what's expected of the builder, but also how an inspection plan needs to be made during the design. And then how inspections and also evidence collection, which we heard all about just now, will need to be made during the project. Then, throughout all of the phases of the project, the client needs to check and get evidence to show that its instructions are being followed. So a much closer relationship between client and project, and right the way through. You don't just turn your back and walk away after everybody's been set in motion. Okay, so let's look at designers. How does their culture change need to adjust? Well, designers really need to be more inquisitive. And as well as completing their designs, and I would suggest they now, and we've heard of this already, acting as principal designer, because often it's the QS or project managers that currently take that role. But as the design progresses, they need to decide which elements are of key importance, and then how they should be independently inspected and what evidence should be collected to prove compliance. Okay, so they make all their decisions, and then during construction, they need to check that this independent inspection and collection of evidence is done. Or perhaps better still, designers could actually do the inspection and evidencing themselves. Now, site inspections scare some designers, but there's really no need to be scared. As long as the element to be inspected is identified, the method of inspection and the evidence to be collected are clear, then just as always, they simply have to act with reasonable skill and care. And then whatever they do will be insurable. Let's turn to quantity surveyors now, and they need to really broaden their horizons a bit. So they must still manage costs, but they need to look further than capital cost. And they must believe in the value of proper inspection and collection of evidence to prove compliance. They need to appreciate how this can save vast sums of money during construction and after construction is complete by avoiding costly remedial work to correct errors. They need to check up on those doing the inspections. So they're sort of checking the checkers, if you like, and also checking that they're collecting the right evidence so the client is getting good value for money. So that's how I think quantity surveyors will need to change. Now let's move on to builders. Now builders need to do two things really. They need to make their instructions really, really crystal clear, and then supervise and monitor to ensure that those instructions are followed. So until competency improves across our industry, we really can't assume that all operatives will truly understand how to complete every single task that they're set. Builders need to help them by clearly explaining tasks, perhaps providing training using, for example, toolbox talks for specific important items. And we must no longer assume that tick sheets prove compliance. Builders also need to tell operatives and colleagues what evidence needs to be collected during construction to show compliance of each completed element. And then as work progresses on site, builders need to supervise and collect evidence while the element is being built. So in a nutshell, we all need to take a bit more responsibility for our actions. Right, there's a big hurdle. And you may have been thinking that this is all an impossible dream. It seems like a load of extra work, and the initiative really has to be practical. And that's where this big word comes in. We just can't implement the changes I've set out to all elements of a building. It would just be too much. It would be disproportionate, and there just isn't the national resource. But there is a solution. And that, hopefully, or part of the solution anyway, is the new guide. And this is just about to be published. It's published jointly by CIOB and RIBA, and the author is a chartered structural engineer. And the guide sets out a practical way of achieving culture change. And this is the time to use your phone camera so that you can have this guide when it's released. It's not released just yet, but it's not long to go. So the problem is there's just too much to inspect. Instead of trying to look at the whole building, the guide shows how to identify safety critical elements. Now, David Cormie mentioned these earlier, and Mark did as well. And then it explains how to deal with them. So we're only focusing on the elements of key importance, reducing the number of inspections and the amount of evidence needed. And another thing about the guide, remember this formula. Well, I'll tell you what it means. U is usefulness, and N is the number of words. So the usefulness of a document is inversely proportional to the number of words it contains. Well, you can read from the start of the, from the end of the contents page, let's say, to the start of the appendices in 12 minutes. That's how quickly you can read this guide. It also has worked examples in the appendices. I always used to find it really useful whenever I've been doing an exam in the past to have worked examples. Well, here we have it, worked examples here as well. Okay, so what are the key principles for designers and who can apply them, shown in the guide? Okay, so we're considering a particular element. And to use the guide, first, you need to familiarize yourself with the key principles that are set out in the guide. Okay, so you need to read them. Next, you have to decide whether the element is a safety critical element. And the guide explains how you can do that. Next, you have to work out what evidence is going to have to be collected to demonstrate that the element has been installed correctly. And the guide explains that too. Then you have to apply the key principles that are in the guide. Next, you have to decide who's going to do the site inspections, and I'll cover that in a moment. Anyway, after construction starts, they do their inspections, they gather all the evidence required, which can take many, many different forms. So we're not just talking about video recordings or photos, there could be delivery slips, test results, all sorts of things. And when the evidence is all collected, it's then added to the golden thread of information about the building. And these are a part of the insurance records, sorry, assurance records to which Mark referred in the previous presentation. So, who can do the independent inspections? Now, bear in mind that throughout construction, the builder is responsible for getting it right, and none of this initiative dilutes that responsibility. Subcontractors will be asking their own supervisors to review work. The main contractor will also be reviewing, and when the task is complete, there'll be a sign-off. So independent inspection should be a lot easier within this new culture. However, subcontractors and main contractors can't provide independent inspection. Independent inspectors, they could be third-party certifiers. Now, you'll have come across people like this with certain, perhaps fire doors or gas-proof membranes. You often get third-party certifiers, and they would be appropriate to do this. Or clerks of works. But the thing you've got to remember, there are not many available now. For example, compared to 20 years ago, there's not the national resource to provide clerks of works to the extent that we're suggesting. Or, more importantly, the designers. And it doesn't matter whether they're employed by the contractor or by the client. It doesn't matter what form of contract you're under. They're sufficiently independent to inspect their own designs. Right, well, independent inspection comes at an increased capital cost, but it saves money ultimately by avoiding errors, remedial work. I mean, look at the billions being spent at the moment, and most importantly, people's lives. And just to explain this, let's consider two projects. So there's a road and a building. Both of them cost 15 million quid, let's say. The building is far more complex than the road. Routinely, the road will have a resident engineer supported by assistant engineers and administrators, all involved with independent inspection and testing. So that's the road, the simpler thing. Conversely, the building will be lucky if it has one independent inspector at all looking out after it full time. We spend about 10 to 20 times more inspecting civils projects than we do on buildings. No wonder we hear of so many problems with buildings. We just are not investing in a key area of construction, and that's independent inspection. And the balance now needs to change. Okay, you may like what you hear, but there will still be clients that are only interested in capital cost and will not see the value of independent inspection, so they will ignore this initiative. How can we encourage them down this path of righteousness? Well, think about this. Few clients would ever tell designers to design beams flimsier than allowed by the relevant standard. That would be a risk they would not be prepared to shoulder. In the same way, few clients would instruct designers to ignore a standard specifying how their designs must be scrutinized. So a new British standard document is the way to gain widespread traction. We haven't got one yet. We need to push for this. It's a market mechanism, as Dame Judith mentioned, that will drive cultural change, a market mechanism that will drive cultural change. So here's a summary. What do you need to do? Get the guide and read it. Share it with colleagues and clients. Promote its adoption on projects. When you've got a project on which it's adopted, use it to identify safety critical elements, how they should be inspected and by whom, and the evidence to be collected. Get commissioned to provide the relevant specific services, perhaps inspection services. Complete the inspections, add the evidence to the golden thread, and then promote the need for a British standard or publicly accessible specification, which is another form that British Standards Institution produce, for independent scrutiny, or as I prefer to call it, autonomous scrutiny. So I hope that with a bit of courage, collaboration, the wheels will start turning and we can make this initiative fly. Thank you very much.